Amrit, welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Amrit, your organization, Plant ATP, just did an analysis of the public funding, the EU public funding, with a specific focus on plant breeding. What were your findings?
Yeah, so we basically looked at the trends for the past 20 years, starting with FP7, and we saw that overall the framework programs budgets are increasing. So they increased by 43% over the last 20 years. And then we specifically looked at plant breeding research, and that has only increased by 9%. So we're actually seeing a lower allocation of funds for plant breeding research specifically. We see also more specific calls where policy goals are pushed a little bit more, so asking for project outcomes to be relevant both for conventional and organics. And so that could, in some cases, limit the use of, for example, plant breeding innovation like NGTs. And we also looked at the consortium profiles, and we see that there's an increase in private partners being involved in plant breeding related research. But it's actually lower than it is over average for the entire framework program. So only 20% in Horizon 2020 versus 28% over the whole framework program. So there's still quite a bit of margin to involve the private sector more in these projects.
And I find that quite worrying, Amrit, because there is still a small increase, but the increase is much lower than in other fields. And that is worrying because, you know, with all the food security issues and so on, we should be very much focusing on plant breeding and plant breeding innovation. Is the EU spending its money in the right places?
Well, so in Horizon Europe, they've set in place a lot of mechanisms to basically meet the Green Deal goals, and especially farm to fork and biodiversity, for example. And so they've set up a lot of partnerships, missions, and so on. And they cover really a lot of very important topics like biodiversity, soil, water, agroecology, digitalization. So really a number of things. There's a lot more than that. But we see two shortcomings with that. Basically, all of the partnerships are public-public. So they do not involve private partners, at the exception of the Circular Bioeconomy Joint Undertaking, which is focused on bioeconomy, but it's more of how to process and repurpose side streams for the bioeconomy rather than looking really at breeding, for example. And then we basically don't see that plant breeding is not strategically addressed anywhere. There are a few calls here and there, but there's actually nothing really coordinated.
Yeah, another worrying development. That's not so great. Why is it so important that the EU invests in research and innovation, and more specifically in plant breeding research?
Well, basically, plant breeding really has the potential to provide an impact across a really wide range of topics and challenges. So anything from, of course, sustainable food systems and agriculture, but also bioeconomy, food waste and loss, energy, soil, water, biodiversity, and so on. And so really, and it's also a long-term impact. So basically, it's a long process. So it's something that's more in the medium to long term. So for example, the different areas that I mentioned for the partnerships and missions, those are more short to medium term solutions. But in the long term, if we don't have better varieties that are more adapted to this variety of different production systems and needs, we're going to hit a glass wall. So we're basically really calling for action for a public-private partnership on plant breeding for the next framework program for FP10.
Wonderful. Good luck with your call to action. Thank you, Amrit.
Thank you.